Where does this all end? Are we going to end up with 2 super conferences or 3 super conferences?
I don't know. You do feel more pressure for consolidation. I think what's unusual, first of all, college football is the #2 sport in America. And it's a big business, it's a multifaceted, and it's run by a very fragmented industry. And so it's a bit unwieldy. And I think what you see is that the suppliers, the TV networks, have a bigger say because of the fragmentation and the lack of really a unified vision or leadership in college sports. So therefore, it's a little bit of the Wild West.
We'll start exactly there. Who is running it? Is it college presidents? Is it athletic directors? Is it the television providers? Is it the Congress? Who's running it at this
point? It's
point?
really the college presidents of the individual universities. But as you've seen, they're not always loyal either. USC, UCLA. LA leaving the Pac-12, a conference that had been around since 1915, right? And so it's very fragmented and self-interested. There isn't a unifying group that looks out for college sports and has the ability to lead college football.
What's going on with streaming? I mean, we see this with ESPN right now, ESPN Plus. We've just had earnings come out of Disney. That seems to be changing sports. Back in the old days when I was involved with ESPN, you knew how much money was coming up because of those basic cable deals. Those seem to be going away. How's that going to change the business?
Well, it's in transition, but what you see really, a lot of the leagues today have tied their rights up long-term to linear television. So the money's in linear television, but the new viewers and new consumers are in streaming. And also, as you point out, the margins are quite different between linear and the cable bundle than they might be for streaming. So it's going to be a 10 to 15-year transition, and we're at the early days of that. I think you'll see in the NBA, they'll do a streaming deal as part of their national package, I think to help mitigate some of the challenges that cord cutting is creating for regional sports networks. So I think it'll be a transition, an evolution, not a revolution.
Is college football going to learn something from the NFL? I mean, Roger Goodell seems to have been pretty masterful at adding some of the streaming services and not losing the basic cable and other television rights, and just keeps adding the revenue, it seems like.
Yeah, I do think you're going to see it. You haven't really seen any major conference yet do a streaming deal. I mean, I think you'll see games on ESPN Plus. You'll probably see games on Peacock, but you haven't seen Apple or Amazon invest yet, but I think it'll come eventually.
Wasn't Apple really flirting with the Pac-12, in fact?
They were flirting with the Pac-12, put in a meaningful offer, but in the end, it couldn't match the linear opportunities that those schools had at the other conferences.
The Pac-12, and who knows what's going to remain of the Pac-12 at this point. Pac-12 had a streaming strategy, as I understand it. They were really going to go into streaming. It didn't work out for them. What went wrong there?
Well, I think that just the stability of the league, I think the schools felt more comfortable with the money and stability that the linear television package offered versus the instability and the less dollars that the streamers provided. And I think there was some disagreement between certain schools, but at the end of the day, I think people opted for stability and more money from the linear television.
What about the athletes themselves? There's been a lot of question about whether they should get paid. We now have the name, image, likeness phenomenon going on, so I guess they can get some licensing money. But are we going to start paying our college players?
I think that's the big question, David. I think the courts are going to be looking at that in the next 5 or so years. What is the definition of an employee? Do the student athletes meet that definition? The courts historically have been very deferential to the college model, and that's changing. So most of the most recent rulings have actually favored the athletes being paid. And where I see this going, unless somebody steps in, is that the students, athletes are going to be bargaining collectively like they do in the other leagues, not just for money, but also work conditions. Again, college football, bigger than the NBA, bigger than Major League Baseball. Those athletes are being paid a lot of money. These athletes are not being paid any money. I don't think it's a revolution. I hope it's an evolution, a modernization of the game, much in the way the Olympics modernized. You know, before you didn't have pro athletes in the Olympics, today you do. People still love the Olympics. I think you're going to have to modernize. College football is generating anywhere from $5 to $7 billion a year. It's hard to conceive that the participants in those games are not participating in a more meaningful way financially.
Huge business for all the reasons you just described. Are there going to be investment opportunities? We've seen in professional sports teams, as we've gotten private equity interested in it, we even have some sovereign wealth funds who are saying they'd like to participate. We'll see how far that goes. But it's turned into an investment, not just something that a rich person buys as an ego thing. Is there a potential somehow for private equity, sovereign wealth funds, other investors to get involved in college football?
There could be. I mean, you're hearing today from Florida State that's hired JP to look at different investment opportunities for more non-traditional investors. So maybe that might be the beginning of that. I don't know. It's unclear at the moment.
You know this sport. You love this sport. Are all these developments, do you think, going to be good for the sport? And by the way, good for me as the viewer of my Michigan football team.
Yeah, you know, change is inevitable in life, so you have to adapt to change. I would love to see the change come from within the industry. I'd love to see the industry coalesce and lead the change because they're the most knowledgeable people to lead it. My fear is that the courts, just like with the NIL, are going to lead it because the industry won't be able to have a consensus. So my hope is that the industry leads the change and not the courts, but I'm very concerned that the courts will lead the change.
George, great to have on Wall Street Week. Thank you so much for being here. That's George Pine of Bruin Capital. Coming up, as China struggles to get going again, the U.S. added more restrictions on investment in the Middle Kingdom. We talk with Deborah Lair of the Paulson Institute on prospects for the second largest economy in the world.
The world has really been very focused.
The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, these companies need to obey European regulations. That's not surprising. But often these companies choose that they will extend the European standards across their global conduct and their global production because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So there are benefits to standardization, benefits to uniform production. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. And it's then the market forces and the business incentives of global companies that transform that EU rule.
In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Commodities got absolutely crushed.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
China. Its economy has grown faster than any in the history of the world and is either number one or number two to the United States, depending on how you measure it, according to Graham Allison of Harvard.
China is not just a rising power. China has risen. China is now seriously rivaling the U.S. in virtually every domain.
But despite all the progress made, there are questions about whether China can continue its economic miracle, at least at the same pace. Economic numbers have been coming in weaker than expected.
We're not going to see China go back to where it was. It's a very big component of the global economy.
Raising some doubts from Michelle Lamb of Societe Generale about whether China can grow at the 5% pace it set for itself this year.
There's downside risk, and I think that primarily comes from the property sector.
And hopes of government stimulus to keep things going are not as bright as they might have been because of all that debt.
Talking about China's debt situation, I think it's a long-standing structural issue, and it's no surprise that China is facing a very big debt problem. And that's precisely one of the reasons we don't see very aggressive stimulus coming from China.
On top of all the internal issues, China also confronts a United States imposing new restrictions on trade and investment, whether it's export controls on shipments of technology to China, or those limits on outbound investment into China President Biden announced this week.
The goal of this executive order is to make sure that we're limiting the ability of financial flows and the know-how that often goes alongside those financial flows to give countries of concern the ability to get around the things that we're trying to prevent them from getting access to, like the most advanced semiconductors.
Leaving investors to grapple with what to do and not do with an economy simply too big to ignore.
You can't rule out China. Since I started to go to China, 1984, per capita income increased by 28 times. It's a power, and it's a smart power.
And to take us through where we are with China right now, we turn to our non-resident expert here at Wall Street Week on China. She's Deborah Lair. She is vice chair of the Paulson Institute, as well as being CEO of Edelman Global Advisory. Deborah, great to have you back on. It always is. We are hearing a lot coming out of China right now. We had numbers this week which were not very encouraging, perhaps some deflation going on. Certainly their trade is down. What is your sense of what's happening? What are the important things we should be looking at in China right now?
Well, so nice to see you again, David. And definitely Xi Jinping has a lot on his plate. The world has really been very focused, I think, on how to deal with a strong China. And now we haven't really thought through some of the implications of a weak China. When we look at what is happening in the real estate market, there are still major challenges ahead. And this is critically important because it's one of the main sources of investment for most Chinese. And so if the market is not doing well there, it has a significant impact on growth and investment opportunities. 2, local debt. This is something that policymakers have been tracking for a long time, and COVID just made it worse. A lot of this debt, and this is what's really concerning, is off the books. And so it's very hard to even track and be aware of. And it relates to how the center is dealing with and forcing a lot of these local governments to take on unfunded mandates, and their main source of revenue previously was from the real estate market. And so if they haven't had access to revenues coming from the sales of real estate, they have to look for other sources. It's a big concern, enough for Xi Jinping to be sending down policy enforcement teams, which you would think after all this time in office he wouldn't have to do anymore. But it shows the concern that they have with local officials and their willingness to actually follow mandates coming from Beijing. And then to top that, you have weakness in the local banks, which again are lending to the local governments and to the local real estate market. Top that with youth unemployment. For many in China, this is the source of their retirement plan, the fact that their children are going to be working and supporting the parents and the grandparents. And the numbers are over 20%. The unofficial numbers are believed to be significantly higher than that. And it creates a real lack of confidence domestically in China and in Xi Jinping's economic policies. Top this with the fact that there's a slowing global economy, meaning that China's export opportunities continue to be hit, and they're down 15%, and changing geopolitics, making it more complicated for companies to be doing business in China, and Xi Jinping really has some rough waters ahead.
Is President Xi at this point solving this problem for the economics of it, or is he solving it for the ideology of it? Because some of his rhetoric has indicated he actually may care more about the party and the party rigor in the private sector than he cares about the economics of it.
Well, that's an excellent question. He certainly has been very focused on using the party as the means to govern, whether it's through the government itself, whether it's through the military, whether it's through the judiciary. It's the party that's supreme. and he has tried to create an ideology and a unity through that. We see in the new structuring of the government that it's all the party committees who are actually setting economic policy, and the government more and more is just an implementer. So as we see these difficulties in the government, these weaknesses in the ability to create jobs for the youth, in the challenges in attracting direct foreign investment or venture capital or private equity, the big question will be whether Xi Jinping pivots and focuses more on market opening and creating the confidence and the conditions to continue to attract foreign business, which is necessary if he's going to continue to grow his economy. He can't do it without foreign business being present. We've seen him pivot before. We saw how quickly he was willing to pivot at the end of COVID in opening up to the rest of the world, and we're starting to see signs that he's beginning to reconsider some of his economic policies to be more open and change that emphasis from such a focus on the party, not that it's ever going to go away, but to really be focused more on providing opportunities. Look at what he's been doing in technology and the opportunities now in encouraging platform companies and the tech executives to be innovative, where it wasn't that long ago when they were one of the top targets.
President Xi may decide that he wants to be more open to the rest of the world. Is the rest of the world open to President Xi at this point? Certainly the United States and the West seems to be taking some actions, including this week with the restrictions on outbound investment into China. We see various actions being taken. To what extent does that hamper what President Xi can do? As you know so well, Deborah, foreign direct investment is down rather substantially into China.
It is, and I think one of the biggest questions is around confidence in China and its leadership. Obviously, the United States has to stay very focused on its national security, and these outbound investment regulations are limited to areas that it's concerned that we might be creating competitors to our own national security interests. I think it's going to be important to watch if other countries do the same. There definitely is a reconsideration in Western economies in looking at what their relationship is economically with China. It's not to say that companies aren't investing there and continuing to do business there, but more and more we hear they're looking at China for China, and then they're looking at the rest of the world. Some of China's own policies, including its national security law, are really emphasizing that fact because it's a very murky area, particularly when it comes to issues like data, and more companies are looking at how they can create an island in China for data and not have it linked into the rest of the world. And those issues, even though they may sound small right now, start to have a ripple effect in how CEOs and others are making their investment decisions. And this is one of the reasons. It's not just these geopolitical restrictions that we're seeing that are limiting direct foreign investment in China. It's some of China's own policies that are causing a concern within, I think, the foreign business community.
Deborah, it's always a pleasure, really a treat to have you with us. That's Deborah Lair. She's the CEO of Edelman Global Advisory. Coming up, it looks like we may not get that recession after all. What does that do for all our investing plans based on worst-case scenarios? Well, that's Rick Reeder of BlackRock.
My base case is that inflation is moderating. Those real rates we talked about should come down with a Fed that is now stable and will start cutting rates. So I think the equity market next year will get a nice boost from what I think will be a reduction in the interest rate.
That's next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Sports and money. They've always gone together.
But never before have sports been so massively influential and as lucrative as they are today.
NFL, NBA, none of them were what they are today when they were born.
There's leagues that are being thought of and built every day.
New teams, new leagues, new business models, even entirely new sports.
I never in a million years would have thought this is what my life would be like.
We set out to find what's happening and what's about to happen at the nexus of business, sports, and culture.
Getting involved from a business perspective was something that was very natural and an easy transition for me.
From the pickleball courts of Arizona
to the kabaddi tournaments in India
to the cornhole boards at your local tailgate. This is what's next in sports.
That is definitely not the Fed's intent and has not been the Fed's intent throughout this expansion. We raised interest rates in 94.5 without the intent of causing a recession for sure, and we didn't. And the Fed is trying to do a duplicate of that soft landing now, not to cause a recession.
That was former Fed Vice Chair Alan Blinder on Wall Street Week back in January of 2000, a little more than a year before the U.S. went into a recession following a series of rate hikes. But that was then, and this is now. To bring us up to date on whether the current interest rate policy is likely to give us a similar recession, we welcome back Rick Reeder. He's BlackRock's CIO for Global Fixed Income and head of its Global Allocation Investment Team. Rick, great to have you back on Wall Street Week.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
So where are we right now? Not too long ago, a lot of economists, including Fed economists, as well as Bank of America, others were saying we're going to have a recession. They've all changed their mind. Where are you?
So I think, and I did a presentation a while ago, I called the U.S. economy the polyurethane economy because of how resilient it is, like one of those Tempur-Pedic mattresses, how resilient it is, that it's very hard to dent it. And you think about, I mean, the economy today versus 20 years ago, 70% consumption, 70% services. Think about, to create a recession, if you're 70% services, which are amazingly stable, they don't go into recession, your goods part of your economy, which is now a fraction of the economy, has to really become devastated. The other side of it, I think people misinterpret, U.S. economy is not as interest rate sensitive as it was 20, 30 years ago. People have locked in their mortgages already. The banking system runs differently. Commercial real estate gets hurt. Companies have termed out their debt. They don't rely on the front end of the yield curve like they used to, the Fed funds rate. And then the last point is the big spenders on CapEx in the U.S. economy are companies, tech companies. They're not big borrowers. So I think people overestimate when the Fed raises rates this much, you hurt parts of the economy, the regional banks, the small banks, your commercial real estate, but the rest of the economy is amazingly resilient to it.
So it's fascinating, Rick. I guess the answer to the question of why so many people got it wrong is they had the wrong model. Do we have to revise our economic models going forward for the reasons you just identified? It's a different economy than it was 20 years ago.
100%. By the way, not only a different economy today, so we try and model and project what inflation is going to look like 2-3 years hence, let alone for the next year. Think about now how the economy is evolving around AI and productivity and how jobs are going to evolve. Very hard to think about economies. People look at the analog from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and what happens when rates move. I think you have to look, I mean, we're trying to spend more time on is environmental conditions that you're operating within and what impacts it. Another way, you talk about we have a need for more people. The unemployment rate sits at 3.5% is a structural reason. You look at, and we've talked about on your show a bunch of times, you look at the number of people hired for healthcare, education, not interest rate sensitive. There's a shortage, leisure, hospitality, hotels, restaurants. There's a shortage of people. When you have a 3.5% unemployment rate, because it's structural, it's pretty hard for the economy, at good wages, pretty hard for the economy to go into a deep recession when so much of the economy is consumption.
So let's take a look at the investment profile, given what you've just said. Where does the 10-year want to be? Because so many investment decisions are really keyed off of where the 10-year yield is. Where does it want to be right now? Because I hear people saying in the mid-3s, low 3s. I hear people say in the mid-4s.
So, I think, around 4%, I think is a reasonable resting place. My sense is there's a couple of factors that work against one another. First one is Treasury's issuing an amazing amount of supply. We're going through the issuance, and the Treasury just announced they're going to increase the supply longer on the curve. They relied on immense amounts of Treasury bills. You're seeing this almost almost $300 billion a week gross supply, not net, but gross supply of Treasury bills. So you're going to get more supply. So that tends to push rates a bit higher. However, inflation is coming down. You look at the CPI data, and I was looking at the 3-month moving average of core CPI. If you strip out some of this funky used car stuff, is only 1%. So now you take, okay, so it's actually 1.1%, 3-month moving average. So you say, okay, 10-year note now, the real rate net of inflation, it's not bad. I mean, the level on 10 years. So I don't think we're going very far. I think the supply could push 10 years a bit higher. If you said to me, where are we going to be 6 months from now, 9 months from now, a year from now, I think the 10 years is going to migrate lower, because if you believe that inflation is coming down, which I think is right, then the 10 years should start to move closer to 3.25, and I think we'll see that next year. But for the next couple of months, it's sticky at these levels.
We had so many debates about hard landing, soft landing, what kind of landing. You suggested maybe we may not have a landing at all.
Yeah.
So given that, does that change your investment outlook right now? Does it change how you invest your money?
So I got to say one thing about it. I mean, I think the economy is moderating from extraordinary 12.3% nominal GDP in 21, 7 and change percent in 22. That is unbelievable. I'm not saying we can't slow a bit, and even could you have a technical recession? I just think you'd have to wake people up and tell them, because you're operating at such a high level in the economy. So how do we think about it? Listen, I think there are a lot of equities that make sense today. The equity market's had a really good run. 7 stocks, 8 stocks have driven it. There are a lot of companies. If you believe the economy is stable, you can buy a lot of businesses that trade at 3, 4, 5 times cash flow. If you believe the economy is stable, autos, airlines, home builders, some of the energy infrastructure trade at pretty low multiples. So I like owning the equity market, so I like running portfolios. I think you have upside in equities, and then you can create amazing amounts of carry. The front end, I talk about the front end of the yield curve, you can buy commercial paper buying 6%. If you can create a 6 and then own some equity, and by the way, it gets to your point about, do I need to own a lot of 10-year or 30-year treasuries? That at 4, I don't know, not that interesting, but I can buy a lot of front end, a lot of yield, and then buy some equity, and so get some upside with some real income.
On the equity front, talk about the discount rate, because we're up now north of 5, right?
Yeah.
Some people think it's going to come back down next year fairly quickly. Other people think it may stay up there. That really affects the value of those equities and the valuations you're talking about, doesn't it?
100%. And so, by the way, my base case is that inflation is moderating. Those real rates we talked about should come down with a Fed that is now stable and will start cutting rates. So I think the equity market next year will get a nice boost from what I think will be a reduction in the interest rate. By the way, credit spreads are also really tight. Companies don't borrow off. They borrow off of their spread to treasuries, and they're pretty tight. So the discount rate is not bad today for equities, but it is, my sense is it's going to come down from here.
So you were anticipating Fed cutting rates next year.
Yeah.
I mean, how early and how much?
I mean, I think the Fed would like to stay on hold for a period of time. But I think as you get into the second half of the year, then and maybe earlier if inflation decelerates quicker, can you start to do 25s a meeting? I think so. I think these restrictive rates, my sense is, I would talk about your show a lot. Because the economy is not as interest rate sensitive as it used to be, those restrictive interest rates really hurt small banks. They really hurt commercial real estate. They hurt targeted parts of the economy, which quite frankly I think have been overdone. And the other thing they really hurt is the U.S. government is running over $30 trillion in debt. The Treasury has usually borrowed at Treasury